I had heard rumors about the abandoned lighthouse on Cape Cod for years, the kind of eerie whispers you only hear on stormy nights, the kind that make you think twice about venturing near the place. The weather-beaten tower stood on a craggy rock outcropping, isolated from a nearby village by miles of dense forest and jagged cliffs. It was said to be haunted, its history tied to a tragic tale of betrayal and murder. But I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. After all, I was a marine biology student, rooted in the tangible, in the science of the world. The supernatural wasn't my realm. I was there to study the marine life in the surrounding waters, to conduct research for my thesis, and nothing more. It was mid-October when I made my way to the lighthouse. The day had been cold and dreary, a constant drizzle of rain soaking the landscape as I trudged the overgrown path that led to the lighthouse. The tall grass rustled in the wind as I approached the tower, which stood ominously against a dark sky. The building had been abandoned for over 50 years, its paint chipped and faded, and the windows boarded up. But despite its dilapidated state, there was something undeniably magnetic about it. I couldn't explain why, but I felt an unshakable pull toward the place. I spent the first few hours inside, setting up my equipment. The lighthouse's interior smelled musty, the air thick with dust and the remnants of long-forgotten memories. The floorboards creaked beneath my boots, and the occasional scurry of rodents echoed from the walls. I set up a small cot in one of the rooms, planning to stay the night, so I could observe the waters at dawn. As the evening wore on, I began to feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The lighthouse had a strange aura, as if something or someone was watching me. I shook off the feeling, blaming it on the isolation and the bleak atmosphere. I made myself some tea and settled into a chair, the only light coming from a flickering candle I had set up on the table. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, but then I heard something strange. At first, it was faint, like a low, muffled cry carried on the wind. I sat up straighter, straining to hear. The cry came again, this time louder, more distinct. It was a voice, or what sounded like one, coming from above. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The lighthouse tower was on the second floor, and there was no one else there. No one could have been up there. I hadn't seen a soul since I arrived. My instincts told me to ignore it, to chalk it up to exhaustion or a figment of my imagination. But something compelled me to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way up the creaky staircase that led to the tower. The light flickered as I ascended, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The cries grew louder, and as I reached the top of the stairs, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing by the large, broken window of the tower, was a figure. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a gaunt face. He wore a tattered uniform, a long coat with the insignia of a lighthouse keeper. His hair was matted, his skin pale and almost translucent. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto mine, and I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. You can see me?" The man's voice was hoarse, like it hadn't been used in years. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My heart raced in my chest. This couldn't be happening. I was alone in an abandoned lighthouse, and I was talking to a ghost. "I'm Henry," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Henry Crawford. I was the keeper here. I need your help." I didn't know what to say. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing and hearing. Ghosts weren't real, were they? But the figure before me felt too real, too solid, to be a figment of my imagination. "Please," Henry continued, his voice trembling. "I was murdered. They made it look like an accident, but I was killed by smugglers. They killed me, and the truth was buried with me. You must help me." I could barely process his words, but one thing was clear. Henry wasn't at peace. He had been wronged, and his death had been hidden under a veil of lies. I could see the torment in his eyes, the desperation that clung to him like a second skin. "I'm dead," Henry said, almost as if he were reminding himself. "But I cannot rest until the truth is revealed. My journal, it's hidden, under a loose brick in the tower. You must find it. It will show you everything." My legs felt weak, but I nodded, determined to help him in some way. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I couldn't ignore the plea in his voice. Henry pointed to the far wall of the tower, where an old, crumbling brick section jutted out. "There," he whispered. "It's under there. Please." I walked over the wall, my heart pounding. I reached down and felt the loose brick beneath my fingertips. It came away easily, revealing a small leather-bound journal wedged beneath it. I held it in my hands, my fingers trembling as I opened it. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded, but the words were still legible. The journal was filled with accounts of smugglers who had been operating along the coast, using the lighthouse as a cover for their illegal activities. Henry had discovered their operation and threatened to expose them. In response, they had killed him, staged the scene to look like an accident, and buried the truth. The journal contained names, dates, and locations, evidence that could bring the criminals to justice. I knew what I had to do. The next day, I contacted the authorities, providing them with the information from Henry's journal. The smugglers were arrested, their operation dismantled, and the truth about Henry's death was finally revealed. It was a bittersweet victory, knowing that Henry would never see the justice he deserved in life. But in death, he had been vindicated. With the case closed, the lighthouse was finally recognized as a historical landmark, preserved as a tribute to memory of Henry Crawford, the man who had given his life for the truth. I wrote a book about my experience, about Henry's story, to ensure that his name would live on. It was the least I could do. As for Henry, I like to think he finally found peace. I visited the lighthouse one last time before I left Cape Cod, standing in the tower where I had met him. The air was calm, the sky clear, and for the first time, I didn't feel the weight of his presence. It was as though he had truly moved on. The lighthouse still stands, its light shining out over the sea, a beacon for all who seek the truth. And in a way, Henry's story continues to guide me, reminding me that redemption is possible even in the most unlikely places. It was a cold October evening when I first heard the stories about Pinebrook Manor. I was sitting in my high school library, bored out of my mind, flipping through old local newspapers that I had been searching for paranormal articles. That was when I stumbled upon an article buried in the back pages. It was from the early 1900s, about a family of four, William, Margaret, and their two children, Alice and Thomas, who had tragically died in a fire at Pinebrook Manor. At first, it seemed like a standard accident, a family trapped by the flames in a mansion that was long past its prime. But as I read on, my heart skipped a beat. The rumors were there, whispers from townsfolk that the fire wasn't an accident at all. It had been set deliberately, and there were hints that something far more sinister was at play. My curiosity was instantly piqued. I had heard the ghost stories. Everyone in the town had. Pinebrook Manor was notorious for its eerie atmosphere and strange occurrences. The house had been abandoned for decades, left to crumble under the weight of time. The authorities had ruled the fire an accident, but some people still believe it was a murder, an act of greed from a wealthy businessman named Thomas Randolph, who had been determined to buy the land for a new hotel development. Rumors persisted that Randolph had been desperate enough to rid himself of the family who owned the property, and the fire, with its tragic consequences, was his way of ensuring the deal would go through. As an avid fan of paranormal investigations, I couldn't resist the urge to explore the mansion myself. I had spent hours watching videos and reading stories about other brave souls who had dared to venture inside, but none of them had ever returned with solid proof. The manor had been off limits to the public for years, but I had a gut feeling that if I was careful enough, I could uncover the truth. The night I decided to go was cold, with the moon barely visible behind thick clouds. I grabbed my camera, along with all the equipment I thought I'd need, voice recorders, EMF detectors, and my trusty flashlight. I had no real plan, but I was determined to get to the bottom of what happened inside Pinebrook Manor. The mansion loomed in the distance as I approached, its silhouette dark and foreboding against the night sky. I felt a strange mix of excitement and fear knotting in my stomach, but I pushed forward. There was no turning back now. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a dusty interior that hadn't seen life in years. The air inside was thick with the scent of decay, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. As I took my first step inside, the temperature dropped suddenly, the cold biting at my skin. I shivered but continued forward, scanning the area with my flashlight. Every shadow seemed to move. Every creak of the floor sent a chill down my spine. But I had come for answers. I was ready to face whatever waited for me in this forsaken place. I wandered through the house, taking pictures and recording audio, hoping for a sign, a clue that would tell me what had really happened here. The hallway stretched endlessly in front of me, the walls lined with cracked portraits and yellowed wallpaper. It looked like something out of a nightmare. But it wasn't until I reached the grand staircase that I felt it, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. My heart pounded in my chest, and I turned instinctively, trying to locate the source of my unease. That's when I saw her, a figure at the end of the hallway, standing motionless in the dim light. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, her figure almost ethereal against the backdrop of the darkened corridor. Her face was pale, twisted in sorrow. There was something haunting about her presence, something otherworldly that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I froze, unsure what to do. But she spoke, her voice faint and distant, like a whisper on the wind. "Help me." The word sent a shiver through my spine, but I couldn't turn away. I was drawn to her, as if some invisible force was pulling me closer. My pulse raced, but I knew I had to find out what she wanted. Was she a ghost? Was she one of the family members who had died in the fire? "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly, but I stood my ground. What happened here? The woman didn't respond immediately. She simply stared at me with those hollow eyes, her expression one of deep sorrow. Then, finally, she spoke again. "They killed us for land, for money, for power." Her words chilled me to the core. I could feel the weight of her grief, the anger that simmered beneath her sorrow. "The fire," she continued, "wasn't an accident. It was murder. The fire was set to make it look like an accident. But we were murdered. My family, we were murdered." A lump formed in my throat as I tried to process what she was saying. "Who did this to you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The woman's eyes flashed with a deep sadness. "Thomas Randolph," she whispered, her voice laced with hatred. "The businessman. He wanted our land for a hotel. He thought he could take it from us. He thought we wouldn't fight back." It was then that I realized the truth. The fire had been no accident. The family had been victims of greed, murdered to make way for development. I felt a deep pang of sorrow for them, but at the same time, I knew what I had to do. "I'll make sure people know what really happened here," I promised, my voice steady with determination. "I'll tell the truth." The woman nodded, a look of gratitude crossing her face. "Thank you," she whispered, before fading into shadows. I spent the rest of the night in the mansion, searching through old documents, looking for any evidence that could corroborate what the spirit had told me. It wasn't easy, but after hours of digging to the mansion's long-forgotten attic, I found a letter written by William, the father of the family, to a local lawyer. The letter detailed the threats Randolph had made and the pressure he had put on the family to sell their land. The truth was there in black and white. The next morning, I went straight to the authorities. They were skeptical at first, but when I presented them with the letter and the other evidence I had gathered, they couldn't ignore it. Randolph was arrested, and after a lengthy investigation, he was charged with the murders of William, Margaret, Alice, and Thomas. The family's deaths were finally acknowledged as what they truly were: murder. The case made headlines across the state. The once immaculate reputation of Thomas Randolph was shattered, and Pinebrook Manor, which had been nothing more than a forgotten relic of the past, was finally given the attention it deserved. The restless souls of the family were no longer trapped in the mansion, their spirits finally at peace. But as I stood there, watching the news unfold, I realized something. I had changed. The encounter with the ghost had opened my eyes to a deeper truth. Some spirits had unfinished business, and sometimes it took someone brave enough to uncover the truth to bring them peace. Pinebrook Manor might have been abandoned for decades, but it had finally found its justice. And so had I.